let's talk about March and April. March and April, and excuse me, we just covered March. Let's do April and May. April and May is where we're headed next. In April and May, the U.S. and Iran began nuclear talks. That's a big one that we're going to get to in a moment. But during those same months, April and May, Israel intensified its Sujaiya offense in Gaza City. It also renewed its military operations in some of these areas. We saw heavy fighting in Khan Yunis alone. The months of April and May, we were so focused on Iran during those months. But what was happening on the battlefield during those months? And what did the IDF accomplish during this time period? In retrospect, did this time period get them closer to achieving their war goals?
This time period was very, very significant. One could question how much this brought Israel closer to achieving the war aims in the sense of releasing the hostages and destroying Hamas. But what this was a significant game changer from the way Israel had been operating until then, throughout 2024. Really, the periods of fighting are 2023, 2024. Then we have that break at the beginning of 2025 from January to March. And then March, April, May, June is really a new phase in the Gaza Strip. And I'll show you what I mean by that. If you want to expand the camera, I'll show it here on the map. So what ends up happening is when the war starts, and throughout 2024, Israel takes over the majority of Gaza City up here, and then withdraws. It withdraws, and Hamas gradually takes over again. It then took over parts of Khan Yunis and Rafah, and then ended up withdrawing. And what happened when we had the truce at the beginning of 2025, we really ended up in a situation where the Israeli military was in control of the outskirts of Gaza, but not really in control of the center. And until then, the entire way the IDF was operating in the war was coming into these areas, attacking Hamas, attacking tunnels, and then withdrawing. What changed in March, April, May of 2025 is the IDF decided to take over territory and hold it. It started from Rafah. In March and April, the Israeli military ordered the complete evacuation of all Palestinians from the southern area of Rafah. At that point, we're talking at roughly 400,000 Palestinians, ordered them into the Al-Muwasi region, and completely took over Rafah and developed what was known as the Morag Corridor, which is a corridor that really shuts off Rafah over here, and the Israeli military set up camp here. It then did the same thing in May in Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis' area over here developed a corridor that was known as the Magen Oz Corridor that goes along here, ordered all Palestinian civilians to evacuate from this area and set up here. And the same thing happened, as you mentioned, in Sajaiya up here, Beit Hanun, all these areas in Gaza City. What that meant was that Hamas started to lose territory, and that was the main aim that Israel said is going to change its war aims from this sort of attack and retreat approach that it had in the Gaza Strip. Israel was now going to take over territory and was going to hold on to that territory, possibly as a bargaining chip, possibly in order to continuously purify the area from Hamas tunnels, maybe look for hostages and things like that. So really throughout March, April, and May of 2025, we had the Israeli military launching several different operations. One of them was called Gideon's Chariots. The other one was called, I forget right now, it had lots of different names that they were doing in these different cities. All of that was aimed at showing that now we're in a new phase of the war. Why that's very significant is not necessarily because that brought about the destruction of Hamas. It did not. Hamas is not destroyed. What that did do, though, was completely reshape the landscape of the Gaza Strip much more long-term. Until then, lots of areas of the Gaza Strip had been destroyed in the war as a result of fighting. However, since then, those areas that the Israeli military took over are also being destroyed, flattened, and reshaped. Rafah has been razed to the ground, and that is not as a result of active fighting. That is much more as a result of the fact that the Israeli military has taken it over and is now purging it house by house of tunnels, of weapons factories, of all these things, but it's not the same levels of destructions that are from bombings that happen and then some buildings stand, some buildings not. It's much more a complete reshaping of the land structure. So, did it bring Israel closer to its aims? Some could argue yes, because those areas now are not areas that Hamas or Jihad or other operatives can operate from with any measure of ease, on the one hand. On the other hand, if we look at the total aims, which are the destruction of Hamas, has not brought that about. Hamas is alive and well in the areas that it still does control. And the return of hostages, very, very few, if any, hostages were rescued during that time. They ended up being brought back as a result of the deal at the end of 2025. So it did advance Israel from a military perspective, but in terms of achieving the war aims, that's more questionable.
We have to talk about the 12-day war. You and I were on the air while the 12-day war. We were on the air quite a bit during that time period. Starting in April, and it really April leading into June, the U.S. and Iran, they began holding discussions at first about ramping down Iran's nuclear program. The White House declared at one point that Iran had 2 months. They had a 2-month deadline to secure a deal. A deal was not secured in 2 months. And the day after that deadline passed in June, Israel carried out a strike in Iran. For the next 12 days, Israel and Iran engaged in a direct war with massive U.S. and Israeli airstrikes on Iranian nuclear and military sites. And then we also saw Iran carry out missile and drone attacks back at Israel. A U.S. brokered ceasefire did eventually end the 12-day war. Alon, what was actually accomplished? If we look back at the 12 days of war between the two countries and then the U.S. also getting involved, what was actually accomplished in those 12 days in retrospect?
So there's a lot of things that happened in the region leading up to the war that happened in June. And for that, we also have to take a step back, because during those 2 months that you were discussing that the United States and Iran were negotiating, other things happened in terms of the regional alliances in the Middle East also. And the biggest thing that would happen is this big trip that US President Trump took to the Middle East in the middle of May. In the middle of May, he takes a big trip to the Middle East. He goes to Qatar, he goes to the United Arab Emirates, and he goes to Saudi Arabia. And in Saudi Arabia, he also meets with the new president of Syria, Ahmed Ashara. And very importantly, he does not go to Israel. That was a big signal of the changing regional dynamics in the Middle East. Trump, in that meeting, seemed to have had a change of heart as far as how he perceives the regional alliances in the Middle East. If until now it was the United States and Israel versus a more radical Islamic world or a more moderate Islamic world and an Arab world, and trying to maneuver those strategies, now Trump was saying, actually, I can have a very good, tight, blooming economic relationship with Qatar, with the United Arab Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, that does not need to be beholden to Israel or not. That's going to become important later on. Why that's relevant to what happened to Iran is because the one common denominator between Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Syria is they all fear Iran. They all fear Iran's expansion. They all have been affected by Iran's proxies in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, sometimes in Syria also. And so that has to also be taken into context, that Trump was saying, I'm negotiating with Iran, but meanwhile solidifying these alliances. Everyone in the Middle East that Trump is closer to, Israel, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and then Syria, were all saying, but we fear Iran's nuclear program. That is the reason that it was less surprising when the United States was willing to say, okay, we'll endorse also the attacks against Iran, because it wasn't just about the relationship with Israel. It was about also showing those other countries in the Middle East that they can depend on the United States. And that's important because during Trump's first presidency, he pulled out of a lot of the American deals. And a lot of countries in the Middle East were a bit fearful of that. So that was part of the grander strategy that Trump had when it came to the war with Iran. In terms of what was actually accomplished, look, several things need to be noted. First, most of Iran's nuclear facilities were badly crippled or destroyed. That is a fact. The facilities in Tehran, in Natanz, some of the other facilities further down south, some of them were completely destroyed, some of them were mostly put out of commission. That said, the main enriched uranium warehouses in the mountains of Fordo, all military intelligence seemed to indicate were not destroyed. Now, Trump and Netanyahu have tried to frame this as nonetheless a victory. They have gone as far as to say, we didn't want to actually destroy those. We just wanted to send a message. Personally, I find it hard to believe that Israel is going to throw all of its weight against Iran, and Trump is going to send the famous B-2 bombers to carry out massive bombings in Fordo, but that they didn't actually want to achieve the destruction of what they said they wanted to destroy. So, to some extent, the military side of the attack is a mixed bag. On the one hand, there were great successes in crippling most of Iran's nuclear facilities. On the other hand, Iran also showed, but you have not managed to destroy our enriched uranium vaults in the mountains of Fordo. That's on the military side. Another side, though, that has to be talked about is the side of deterrence from both sides. And in that sense, both Israel and Iran, this was the first time that they threw massive weight against each other. Throughout the war, we had several rounds of attacks, once Israel clandestinely, once more actively, and twice Iran more actively firing missiles at each other. But this was the time that the sides said, okay, all bets are off. And in that, Israel clearly had the upper hand because in its initial strike, it managed to take out most of the Iranian military leadership. I remember I was talking to you live, and these reports were coming in that the chief of staff has been killed, that the head of the Air Force has been killed, the head of the IRGC has been killed. All this happened as a result of Mossad agents on the ground in Iran. So Iran really was shown to be vulnerable to that, on the one hand. On the other hand, throughout the war, we also saw Iran's missiles getting more and more sophisticated. In the first volleys of missiles that Iran fired at Israel, they fired a lot of missiles and most of them were intercepted. Throughout the war, more and more of their missiles were able to actually penetrate Israel's air defenses. One of them hitting the equivalent of Israel's Pentagon, hitting right outside what's known as the Kiryat. So on the one hand, when it comes to deterrence on both sides and sort of showing your cards, Israel's cards seem to be the stronger ones. On the other hand, there's also growing fear among the citizens in Israel of saying, yes, but we can't necessarily withstand another 100 or 200 Iranian missiles being fired at us. So did the attacks in Iran succeed? They succeeded to some extent. Were the messages from both sides sent that don't mess with us, so to speak? Or Israel and Iran have been talking for years about building up deterrence from one another to not attack the other one. Israel was shown to be the smarter party when it comes to intelligence on the ground, but Iran was also showed that Israel has vulnerabilities when it comes to missiles landing in the cities in Israel. And these are all things that are going to be considered as the sides are now again beating the war drums a little bit. It's all things that are going to be considered as things move forward.
I believe it was the president of Iran that had some choice words lately. We can perhaps get into that as we get into the later portions of the year. We can't do an annual recap without talking about the humanitarian conditions in Gaza. In July, some would say that's when the humanitarian crisis peaked. Some Western powers were demanding an immediate end to the fighting in the summer months. They also demanded the end of aid restrictions. They wanted Israel to lift some of the aid restrictions that were on the enclave. So, Alon, what is the story of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza this year? I mean, we're looking at images of planes dropping food for some residents. Here's some images of those cities of tents. It's been incredibly challenging for so many people in the enclave. So how would you describe the story of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza this year, Alon? And how did it play a role in getting an eventual peace deal done, in your opinion?
The humanitarian aspect is a critical aspect in every war. And in the war between Israel and Hamas, it is arguably one of the most important ones. And there's a lot of reasons why this is, and a lot of people have cited different things, and that's more of a theoretical discussion. The fact is, it is one of the most important ones. And this year has really seen swinging from side to side in terms of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. At the end of 2024, the humanitarian situation in Gaza was in dire condition. The majority of people were living in makeshift refugee camps after they had been relocated time and again. There was scarcity of food. scarcity of clean water, very, very poor hygiene situations. And really, a lot of this ended up being a result of restrictions that were imposed by the Israeli military on aid trucks coming into Gaza. Then it was mismanagement of the United Nations and other distribution agencies in Gaza. And then it was Hamas stealing some of the aid and then reselling it on the black market within Gaza. All those things came together. Then the beginning of 2025 happens and we have that first truce. During that first truce, all of a sudden the humanitarian situation improves. It does not become a wonderful place to be. But the humanitarian situation improves for three different reasons. One, the fighting stops. De facto, the fighting stops. That means less people are injured. There's less of a burden on the medical institutions, such as they are, the makeshift field hospitals of the Red Cross and etc. So more people can get access to other medical facilities as well. Fact number one. Fact number two, as part of that truce agreement in January and February of 2025, there was a massive increase in the amount of aid trucks coming into the Gaza Strip, up to about 600 a day. That is up from about 200 to 250 per day. That's a big difference. So lack of fighting, aid trucks can move across the Gaza Strip, and then also more aid coming in. A third factor is that with the institution of that truce at the beginning of 2025, it was the first time that Palestinians were allowed to move further north in the Gaza Strip. Ever since October of 2023, they were not allowed to return to Gaza City, which led to very, very dense populations in the areas of southern Gaza Strip, a refugee camp known as the Al-Mawasi refugee camp, which prior to the war held about 200,000 or 300,000, was home for about 1.8 million people. That unto itself is a humanitarian disaster. So all those things came together in the first months of 2025, and that's why things started to improve. Again, not be wonderful, but improve. Then we had a complete collapse. With the end of phase one of the ceasefire on March 2nd, before the fighting resumes, Israel says phase one is over. We have not negotiated phase two, and therefore all of the agreements that are part of phase one, including the entrance of humanitarian aid, are now null and void. And starting on March 2nd, for a period of close to 3 months, there is no humanitarian aid coming into the Gaza Strip. That led to an increasing disaster. By the end of April, the World Central Kitchen and the World Food Program are saying we have to shut down our food pantries in Gaza because we are literally out of food. Cases of malnutrition, children that are dying from starvation started to be reported. In May, the United States and Israel launched this new thing that they instituted called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. This was orchestrated by Steve Witkoff, and again, it really depends who you're talking to if this is seen as a genuine attempt to bring relief to the Gaza Strip or if it's seen as another thing that just brought about more devastation. Regardless of who we believe, the fact is that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was a new plan to say we're not going to let aid be stolen by Hamas. Instead, they're going to set up distribution areas in southern Gaza that are going to be secured by private companies that Palestinians will be able to come to and receive food packages. Many, many people ended up receiving food as a result of this. Many other people also ended up dying in violence around these centers, and Hamas was also stealing from people once they got the food. So again, a mixed bag. All this led to the fact that, as you said, by June, July, the situation was an increasing catastrophe because there was no aid that was getting into northern Gaza. There was these distribution centers in southern Gaza that were coming under massive international condemnation because one of the things that Israel's prime minister has a warrant out against him in the International Criminal Court. One of the charges is using starvation as a method of war. And one of the things that they said is setting up these centers down south in order to evacuate Palestinians down south is using hunger as a method of war. Again, I'm not saying if that's right or wrong. I'm not a judge in the ICC. What I'm saying is this came under so much international condemnation that by June, July, really Israel was already being cornered by many members of the EU and increasingly also by, not by Trump, but by members within the Trump administration saying, we might support your endeavors in fighting, you gotta do something to alleviate the situation. And I will say, Israel probably did not do enough to show that they are trying to fix this. I'm not even saying if they could or couldn't, But to show that they realize that this needs to be addressed, Israel did not convince most of the countries, and the United States among them, that it was trying to do enough. And that was a factor that led to the increasing pressures in August on Israel to say that you have to come to a deal because we can't abide these images of starving kids in Gaza as a result of blockades of humanitarian aid. That can't continue. So that was one of the factors that really contributed to the pressures of August.
We have been watching also as we've been showing these images of some of the challenges that so many people in Gaza have been facing. And we see footage of some of the civilians being interviewed. Some of these images, by the way, show, just how many people, it really puts into perspective how many people have been displaced. I believe this particular footage is showing pretty much a mass of people returning to their communities after the current ceasefire was put into effect.
So I'll tell you, this is, just put in the context of this image, this is the Al-Rashid Road. That is one of the two main roads in the Gaza Strip, as known as the coastal road, as you can see the coast there. And yeah, this is the mass return of Palestinians after they were allowed to return north once these ceasefires were brokered. So there was about 1 million Palestinians living in northern Gaza that evacuated down south. They were there for over a year, living in tents in really subhuman conditions. And then once, as we see with these images, once the truces were put into effect, they returned north really en masse, hundreds of thousands of people. Most of them returned to places like we're seeing in these images. They returned to find complete devastation and their homes destroyed. But to some extent, I'll say at least, it resolved the density issue that was people living on top of each other in tents, which really was fertile ground for diseases and lots of other things that were contributing to the humanitarian catastrophe in southern Gaza. And that concludes part 2 of the summary of 2025 in the Middle East. You're watching the Israel-Palestine Report, Professor Alon Burstein. Don't forget to check out part 3. You can find a link in the first comment below, and also to sign up for the Israel-Palestine newsletter, where you can learn about other activities, videos, as well as courses on unpacking the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.